Welcome forward. The clock is ticking, literally. No, it's not 60 minutes. It's the countdown to 2030 for achievements in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and hopefully a 45% cut in emissions. Good afternoon and welcome to all those in the room and online from across the region and around the globe. Many thanks for spending your time with us today. Those online, if you have any questions, I think the instruction should be behind me. I think you know the drill by now. There's a Q&A box. Use the Q&A box to post your questions and we'll get to them as we go through the session if I think it makes sense, or we'll bring them in at the end of the session. So what is the countdown to 2030? But before we get to that, some of you joining from around the world may not know Padang. I'm lucky we have many friends in the room here. Padang & Co. is a Singapore-based innovation catalyst. We're based in Singapore, work across the region, across the globe. Our raison d'etre is all about building communities to work with government, MNCs, large companies, matching them with startups through those communities to take on large problems and opportunities, all in the pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's what we're about. So the Countdown to 2030 is a program we designed and launched at the beginning of 2020, pledging to make conversations about the Sustainable Development Goals more commonplace. We were kind of concerned that, of course, we all knew we had to do things by 2030, that people were not talking about it enough, and frankly, just didn't realize how close 2030 was. And that was before COVID-19 hit. And that totally sidetracked the conversation. More critically, the health crisis that ensued caused real problems for all and turned into a major economic crisis, further setting back our achievement of the goals, in particular with focus on poverty and hunger. And now, as you can see from behind me, we've got less than 8 years to 2030. Back in 2015, the Paris Agreement agreed to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees, hopefully 1.5. But to do that, we have to also get a 45% cut in emissions by 2030. Target that sadly looks like we're going to miss even with the new Glasgow pledges. Real issues. So now as we strive to hit net zero, we must also ensure that we're achieving all of the SDGs, the balance. Now, of course, it's recognized they're connected, but we're really wanting to focus on the balance. So over the course of this year, Padang & Co. will be running a number of sessions attacking this big question, from new foods and agricultural practices, smarter infrastructure, management of water, energy, and waste. Now, quickly before I introduce my fabulous panelists here, the past 12 months between the spikes of Delta and Omicron, a lot has happened. While lots of tragedy has occurred, there's been some pretty positive news and interesting developments. VC investment has been huge globally. In one quarter, we've seen $100 billion invested in startups across the globe. Never before have we seen that kind of volume. And it hasn't all been on alternative proteins. A lot of it has been going into climate tech. The investment in climate tech has doubled. I think it's of those sort of numbers, isn't it, Nish? 90% of global GDP now has levels of net zero commitments around it. Something like about 20% of the world's 2,000 largest listed companies have commitments. And if you think about word clouds, decarbonisation and net zero word clouds have exploded. Lots of things going on. Importantly, standards. We're starting to see a consolidation of ESG standards, which I think is really important to help people understand what we should be doing and how. The rise of Web3. I think that's actually something that's going to be very interesting, how we can utilize Web3 as we get people together. Decentralization, I think, can play a very important part when we're dealing with smallholder farmers, small-scale fishers, and what have you. ESG funds, now in the trillions. So much is happening, and of course, COP26 and the commitments that were made there. Now, yes, there's a lot of talk And yes, a lot of commitments, but where's the action? So let's get to it. To unpack some of these issues and more, we have today been very fortunate to have such a fantastic panel to share their views, help us answer some of these questions, and hopefully give rise to future topics for us as we go forward over the year. And importantly, we do want to move from the what to the how. I think at Sonny Verghese, the CEO of Olam, quite famously, I think now at Ecosperity last year, sort of said, listen, let's leave the what behind. We know that. Let's move into the how. And I think that's a war cry, rallying war cry everybody needs to get onto. And plus, we need to address the Singapore angle. Now, the folks we have here, they're all different, of course, but they're all connected given their focus and passion for impact and sustainability. On my immediate left, many of you know, Anuj Maheshwari is the head of agri-food investment at Temasek. A generational investment, anyone here knows Temasek. It's in there for the long term, 400 billion portfolio. Anuj has been there for 15 years. He founded the agri-food team back in 2013, crafting a strategy in the space well before everyone else was rushing into agri-tech. He and the team have invested over 8 million in the ensuing years, and they've got stakes in some of the big names you'd all be familiar with: Impossible, Perfect Day, Left Farm, and most recently eFishery, really exciting one, which just raised 100 million or thereabouts in the Series C, the largest fundraising for aquaculture anywhere in the world. He's been at the forefront of many of the initiatives at Temasek, and most recently, the Asian Sustainable Food Platform, which I think we might hear a bit about later. Really exciting, and it's just nearby, one of these buildings. I can never quite work out where it is. So thank you for joining us, Anuj. Elizabeth Hernandez heads External Affairs and Sustainability at Corteva. She's an integral member of the leadership team in APAC. Corteva, I'm sure again many might know, it's a standalone agriculture company focused on seed tech, crop protection, and digital agriculture. Elizabeth has been a tech entrepreneur, so she brings a lot of interesting insights to her work with smallholder farmers. Plus, importantly, I mean, she's an amazing advocate for D&I issues and women in agriculture, and serves as a board member of WOMAG, which is a volunteer organisation addressing issues for gender equality and food and sustainability across Asia. So again, someone who's very busy. And finally, on my far left, Steve Mellowich, nearly 3 decades building tech businesses globally. Famously, if I can say that, he's co-founder and was CEO of Unicorn Property Guru. I'm sure you've all used his services at some point finding an apartment here in Singapore. Started that in 2007, and which I think it led the way to many other marketplaces. He stepped down in 2018 and with his wife set up impact investor Planet Rise, making about 30 investments over the last 3 years. I hope that's about right, with a clear focus on climate tech and sustainability. And more recently, again, another busy person, he's a founding partner of Wavemaker Impact, which is the first VC climate tech venture builder in Southeast Asia. And it has a clear goal to reduce 10% global carbon emissions. Now that's focus. So I think you can see that we're very lucky to have these 3 folks, different perspectives, in the room this afternoon. Now I'm going to address something to all of them initially, and then I'll sort of duck and weave with other questions. As I said before, and we've called this session SDGs X NetZero Action. It's not versus, it's of course and. One of my concerns, and it is kind of personal, but also part on, is that there has been so much excitement and focus, which is fantastic, on net zero and the decarbonisation strategies to drive that. Is there a risk, and I feel that there is somewhat of a risk, that we're going to lose some focus on the other SDGs, and importantly, poverty and hunger and health, because people are so focused on one. So not everyone has to agree with me, but I'd be interesting to hear the pushback and why, which would be great. But maybe I'll start with you, Anuj. How do you feel about that proposition that there is a risk?
Thanks, Adam. So look, for sure, last 3-4 years, the call for action on the climate agenda has been loud and clear, and I think everybody has heard that. And there is a clear quantification of what we need to achieve. When there is quantification and there is a goal, then it gets people together much more. When it comes to some of the other goals around the SDGs, I think the quantification is not very clear. And that's probably one of the reasons why we feel that there isn't that much of a focus, and that focus is getting lost with the singular focus on net zero 2050, 2030 targets around that. Look, just stepping back, we do have an issue with the achievements of SDGs at large. The statistic that I would quote is we need about $6 trillion every year to achieve the SDG goals. And today, I think between the government funding, the public funding, another about 3 to 4 is spoken up for. Right. We still have a gap of 2 to 3 trillion per year funding gaps we require to address the issues around poverty, electricity for everybody, certain basic human rights which are required to be done. And therefore, that financial gap exists, and there is no doubt that more capital has to get into solving some of those issues.
And what about you, Elizabeth Corteva? Because again, slightly different state to Temasek. I mean, you're in the field, literally, and so you're touching a lot of them. How do you feel about that proposition that we might, kind of the law of unintended consequences, too much on net zero, not enough on something else?
Well, I think I would agree with what Anuj said about needing the data, the targets, right, to be specified for all of those goals. But I would perhaps disagree about losing the context, because you talked about COP26, and yes, we all know about COP26 and the focus around the net zero. However, another big meeting that happened last year is, of course, the Global Food System Summit by the UN. And in case you didn't know, that was the first time that we really looked at the global food system as a system, right? The recognition that all of these things are interrelated, that you can't really make a change in one part or another, that we're done with that, right? That's what we need, is actually really systemic change. So it has to be viewed holistically. So all of the goals connect to each other. So for me, I think the way we look at it at Corteva is we look at climate positive as kind of like your North Star. And then all of the different goals are the different pathways or roadmaps, which is why you want to have those specific targets for each one that get us there. Now, if you're a multinational company, chances are you would have done your materiality assessment when you're declaring your goals, because you need to know what's actually critical and you can control within your operation, within your supply chains, the impact to your customer. And so that's how you start. So when you set those goals, it's natural that you would focus on the ones that's closest to your business, because you have that core expertise. So for us, for example, we look very much at our innovation, our pipeline first, right? Our operations, and then our customers. So when we focus on the goals, yet we have a climate positive goals and the emissions of scope 1, 2, 3, but we also look at our impact on our innovation, our farmers, on the land, as well as on our own operations.
What about you, Steve? How do you sort of round that out?
Well, I agree with what's been said already. I think for me, what's important is that I guess the sustainability development goals are connected. And I guess if COVID has taught us one thing, is that one big change to the global system has such a rippling effect across all the SDGs. And so, whilst it started with health, it affected the economy, it affected education, it affected social equality, and as a result also then widened the poverty gap. So set back, all of the hard work that we've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years, another 100 million people, close to 100 million people on the poverty line as a result of COVID-19. So you put it in perspective of climate change. I think climate change is going to be at least 10 times bigger than COVID. Then, I think, whilst there is a risk that we lose focus on the other SDGs, I think we don't have an option. I think we have to get to net zero as quickly as possible, otherwise we're screwed. So we can forget about the rest.
Yeah.
So I think, what I am encouraged about is we are now seeing, as you said, some action. We're seeing some commitment. It's still early days.
Yeah.
85 to 90% of the world's economies have now committed to net zero, but the bit that's missing is the action behind that. So yes, there is a risk, but I think the focus on net zero really makes sense. And so when I started thinking about this 3 or 4 years ago, and thinking about climate change, whilst the focus for the Planet Rise stuff that we do is around climate change, the secondary priority is very much around social equality, because as COVID has shown, climate change will affect everybody, but particularly people at the bottom of the pyramid. And so we look at social enterprises, women-led social enterprises, and also particularly migrant workers as well, because they work as migrant workers are particularly affected. And so I guess with my Weightmaker hat on, one of the things that whilst we are really pursuing climate change as an opportunity as well as a necessity, with the Weightmaker main fund, which is more focused around tech, what we're trying to now do is work with the portfolio. The portfolio is 160 companies, and these are tech companies across Southeast Asia. And so we've mapped with the UN the portfolio, and seeing that about 2/3 of those companies are producing something positive towards the SDGs. But also then started to work with portfolios to educate them, to train them, and to gently nudge them to start to make a sustainability pledge.
Okay, is this better? To get some of the portfolio to make a sustainability pledge, even if you're not solving a real sustainability issue. Running your business, whether it's education tech or an insurance tech business or legal tech business or a fintech or a prop tech, doing that in a sustainable way. And so we have a growing number of the portfolio have now put their hand up and said, look, we will put our hand up and we were going to make a sustainability pledge. It's stage appropriate. We're not talking about hiring 20 ESG consultants with a company which has got 20 staff in it. It's around sort of baby steps. So starting small as a company grows, then of course the ambition grows in terms of where you might want to go with that. But the focus so far has been very much around carbon impact and also gender diversity and inclusion and the work with the community.
Right. Okay, I'll come back in a moment about the 100 by 100 because I'm interested to see how you've carved that out. So I think that's, again, a different approach. But maybe, Elizabeth, again, sort of, one of the issues that I think we all see is, are we solving symptoms of a broken food system? Back to your earlier comments. Should we not be, how do we take a far more systemic approach? And how does Corteva sort of really focus on that and really, because I think at times startups might be just looking at points on the system. There's something that's broken, let me fix that, and there's a good economic opportunity there. But are we just treating a symptom and making money out of treating a symptom as opposed to fixing the actual system? And how does Corteva sort of play in that?
Well, maybe the best way to address that, Adam, is to give you an example. In rice cultivation, right? We're in Asia, everybody eats rice. It's a major crop, and 80% of the rice produced in the world comes from Asia. But if you know how it's cultivated, the traditional way of cultivating rice is flooding the fields, right? The paddy fields. It's a beautiful scene that we see when you travel around the region. But what that means is that's also one of the highest emitters of methane and other greenhouse gas emissions, let alone the water, the use of water. So in a place like India, for example, a few years ago when the monsoon rains did not come, for a couple of years, they had a water crisis because the majority of the water table is actually practically depleted in some states, and it's actually being used primarily for agriculture, right? And so what we were looking at is, how do we solve a crisis like that? How do we get more and more of these rice farmers to transition to a more sustainable way of cultivating rice? And there is a direct seeded rice option where you don't have to flood the field. But to be able to do that, you do need the technologies, the right hybrid seeds that will grow with direct seeded rice, the right weed control, because your rice crop will be attacked by the weeds, and the right mechanization, because now that you don't have the flooded field, you can't do that with bare hands. You need the mechanized sower, whether it's handheld or one you attach behind your tractor, to be able to do that. So what we do is we put all of these things together the seeds, the crop protection solutions, partner with a mechanization company that can bring the sowers in, and more importantly, do the hand-holding or training of the farmers, and making sure that that training and those technology are available to both the male farmers as well as the women farmers who often don't have access to such training. So if you do all of that, what does it do? You're addressing one, that you're increasing their yield with that integrated approach, but you're able to reduce the use of water, which is a scarce resource for them. You're able to improve the soil health with that system. You're able to reduce methane and other greenhouse gas emissions. The water reduction is up to 57%. For greenhouse gas emissions, it can be 20 to 30% reduction. And then if you're able to show that the ROI, despite changing the cultivation method, the ROI is actually higher, then you've got a sustainable livelihood for these farmers, right? So that's what we've done. We've partnered with the 2030 Water Resources Group, which is supported by the World Bank, and the state of Uttar Pradesh. So it's a 3-year program. We're converting 40,000 acres of land, again, from traditional paddy field, flooded paddy field, to DSR, direct seeded rice technology. And if we're successful at that, that'd be a huge contribution in reducing those emissions. And what we're looking is, who are the other partners that we can bring into that platform that can make it even more robust and address even more of those goals, right? So for example, is there a way to capture that carbon that we're saving and measure that? And will there be a carbon trading component in the future? Who are the off-takers or the buyers of that sustainable rice? Is there potential through the sustainable rice platform to pay a premium price for sustainable grown rice rather than the regularly produced rice? Those are all of the pieces have come together. And I tell you, it's much more difficult to put a program like that in place when there's so many stakeholders to work that out. But then you really maximize your impact. And that's when we can make really the step change that's needed to make a difference.
Right. Well, yes, I mean, you've outlined an absolutely fantastic program, but I'm sure, it's taken a long time to get there. And maybe we'll loop back into, how do those challenges get solved, and how long did it take? Anuj, given that you are an investor and sort of, again, you do make big bets in some of the investments you do, how do you look at sort of a systems approach versus individual investment opportunities? How does Temasek sort of view it overall?
Yeah, and I think, Adam, it's a very important point, and I think the example that Elizabeth used is a great example. Unless you use a systems approach of fundamental change, and all stakeholders are at equilibrium in a new system, if you're just making some of these cosmetic changes and tweaks, they're not going to stay on. Yeah. So even as we look at making investments into companies, we are looking at the stakeholder equilibrium. How do every part of the ecosystem, of the value chain, benefit from a change out there? So I think it's a very critical part from an investment perspective to look at that. And then, obviously, with every new technology or a new trend, it's not overnight that the whole ecosystem gets developed. Yeah. Certain things come up earlier and other things come up late. So I think as an investor, we do look at investing not just in fundamental new technologies, but also enabling infrastructure and services that catalyze a certain technology. You talked about the Asia Sustainable Foods platform that we announced last year. We did that because we believe that there are a lot of startups who are coming up with the idea of creating alternate new foods, novel foods. However, the solutions that these companies have are interesting from an upstream science perspective, but the downstream customization of these foods to local consumer needs still has to be done. And that requirement is much more in Asia, which also happens to be the fastest growing food market. Mm-hmm. In Asia, it's easy to say it's Asia but we all know sitting over here is that there's a vast difference between Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, China, India, and so on and so forth. Asia might be one continent, but by no means does it have one food type or a cuisine. So in that case, in order to develop the ecosystem, to take a systems approach, we came up with the Asia Sustainable Foods platform, which works with startups to actually bring their products into Asia, get it to Asian consumers, and do it in a capital efficient way where we can provide CDMO and other services around that. So that's just one example of how Temasek is playing a role in developing an ecosystem around a white space that exists. And I think the good thing is, I think more and more investors, impact investors, see that kind of approach coming in, because it's just not about investing in the next startup; it's about developing the ecosystem so that those things stay on.
Steve, I saw you nodding, and certainly, your approach as a venture builder again is slightly different, but you've zeroed in on things and particular customer problems. So how do you look at what's your sort of investment thesis from the 100 by 100 side of things?
Yeah, the reason why I was nodding so much was because a lot of what you're saying, Nisha, it sort of resonates with me, because a couple of years ago I was starting to look at the alternative protein space, and what I saw was the cost of actually developing some of this new technology, whether plant-based or particularly cell-based. The unit cost was so high to go from a desktop to small scale to large scale to big scale. And every single startup you were meeting was trying to do the same thing. And I guess for me, what was missing was that the whole infrastructure place. How can you get the economies of scale, get the volumes up so you can drive the cost down so it starts to become affordable, and therefore it increases the adoption. So I think it's great that you guys are doing that. So in terms of Wavemaker, I guess we looked at where the opportunities were, and then we looked at Southeast Asia, and it felt like a really underserved opportunity. And the reason for this is, so Southeast Asia, obviously a reasonably small but fast-growing contributor to climate change. Population's growing, GDP growth, and therefore emissions per capita are going to go from 2 or 3 tons per head to 10 tons per head. And so you've got increasing emissions, increasing energy consumption, increasing food consumption, and increasing waste taking place across Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia is going to play an increasing important negative impact towards climate change, but it's also going to bear the brunt of climate change. If you think about 3 of the largest cities are going to be underwater by 2050 in Southeast Asia, about 100 million people sitting on the coastlines are going to be severely affected. And at the same time, we're also home to about a third of the global carbon sinks, whether it's forest or whether it's mangroves or peatland. But that's rapidly depleting. So we're contributing more, but we're depleting the sinks, and so obviously a big problem. And then we said, okay, well, let's look at where the opportunities may lie. And the first thing we looked at was, is there a carbon map for Southeast Asia? There wasn't a carbon map for Southeast Asia. It's a global carbon map, but not for Southeast Asia. So we had to go away and build our own carbon map. And that kind of highlighted where the big emissions were. So if you're going to focus on shifting the needle, you need to know where the emissions are, because our philosophy is, look, we want to build 100 megaton businesses, which can become $100 million revenue businesses. To address the 100 megaton business opportunity, you need to know where the emissions are. And so Southeast Asia gets about 2% of the total climate tech investment today. And of that, about 70% goes into EVs. Whereas EVs is transportation is one of the smallest buckets. So if you think about agriculture, land use, industrial processes, and building construction, so just land use, agriculture, and food is about 50%. But then you've got 70% of all this climate tech investment going into EVs. You've got 500 EV companies in India alone. So if you're an investor or you're an entrepreneur coming into the space brand new, which we continually have conversations with, they go, where am I going to invest? Where am I going to spend my time? What problems should I solve? Then naturally are drawn to EVs, but that's not where the problem is. And so we saw this big gap. So we then went away and identified about 50 opportunities where we believe that we can build 100 by 100 megaton, sorry, 100 by 100 companies. In other words, 100 megaton, $100 million revenue, so unicorn businesses. And we're now going down that process. And what's interesting is through the journey is we're meeting increasingly number of entrepreneurs who've built businesses, who've helped scale businesses, who have maybe had some success in exits, and now thinking about what next in a similar way to, I guess, the process I went to 3 or 4 years ago. And it can be overwhelming in terms of where to start. And so what we're hoping to do is take these 50 opportunities, work with experienced entrepreneurs to then build these businesses using predominantly existing technology. Because if you really want to shift the needle in the next 10 years, you want to halve emissions in the next 10 years, Science projects, new technology will play a role in 10 to 20, 30 years, and it's absolutely required. It's not going to shift the needle in the next 10 years. But if you can think about, reducing energy efficiency for, SME factories across Southeast Asia, millions of them, or F&B outlets, or you can think about how do you, a great example just now around how do you reduce methane for smallholder farms. One of the things we're looking at is replacing diesel generators with solar irrigation across Southeast Asia. And on top of that, reducing methane. Can you reduce methane from not over flooding rice paddies? And then could you also then reduce food waste from cold storage? Suddenly you start to say, well, actually, you can really, really start to shift the needle with smallholder farms across Southeast Asia. So that's kind of how we're approaching it with Mega. We hope to end up with a portfolio of companies which are mitigating up to 10% of the global greenhouse gases, and that's probably going to be at least 50 companies. And we're just starting. We made our first investment last year, and we're just in the process of building our second business this year. Very excited about that.
Well, yeah, and I think the point about going with existing technology is really important because, as you say, move the needle. But at the same time, if we're wanting to do different types of carbon capture, can we do it with the existing technology, and how much has to be new?
Trees.
The EV example, I think, is fascinating to think. Why do we think that it is? I mean, Anush, you must probably have looked at EVs as well, in a broader sense. Well, why do you think people are just going into that in such a big way and not the other areas? Do they just not have Steve's maps? Is that the problem? We all need to get a hold of it?
I think that's because Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. So, there is no doubt EVs take a lot of attention, but I think Steve's right. There is a lack of understanding and education in this part of the world, and I'm very glad with what you said is how you are going about it, looking at where emissions are coming from, and then sort of structurally seeing whether it is solar pumps in Southeast Asia or methane reduction in smallholder rice or other such ideas, because unless we come up with solutions which are very specific to a country and a problem we have, it's not going to be appropriate with that. And we need venture builders and ecosystem builders to be able to target that. I think the good and bad over here is the bad is not enough is happening on the climate tech side in Southeast Asia. But the good part of it is it has humongous opportunities, and we all, I think, three of us over here, and certainly many people in this room, including you, Adam, see that huge opportunity which is out there. But the key is to customize the business and the business plan to the needs over here. Just coming up with the next Tesla is not going to be the solution. I think Tesla has come up with a good idea, but there are solutions that need to be customized to this part of the world.
Okay.
Can I just add
Absolutely.
on access, because I think we've heard a lot about technology. So what I always worry about, and I come from technology, I came from Facebook before I went to farming. So I'm early adopter certainly with technology, but one of the things I'm finding in agriculture in particular, it's not the technology not being available, like you said, it's the access. And I want to hear more on the finance side of it, because that's where, when I see the opportunities here, it's being able to bring that. And again, I'll go back to the India example or even one in Indonesia. It's when you're able to put a financing in the middle of that value chain that you're able to transition and to scale. And so I'm curious as to whether what's happening right now, and that's what I'm seeing, right, in terms of finance being mobilized, whether that's key to get existing technologies into the hands of the people who need it most, but getting it faster while we're also simultaneously looking at new technologies being developed and a regulatory system, hopefully like the one in Singapore, that allows us to get those new technologies faster, and get that urgency, similar to what we saw with the vaccines being produced in less than a year in a situation like COVID-19. If we think of the climate emergency with that same urgency as COVID-19, then surely all of the stakeholders, whether it's from business or from government and NGOs and startups, can come together and get that same process, right? It's dual track. It's a technology, it's the existing one, and it's the regulatory framework that will allow us to get these solutions where they are needed.
Well, that's right. I mean, the tragedy is when there's people dying in the streets, there's action. And that's unfortunately what it actually took. We don't want to see that with climate change. We want to mitigate before it gets to that. So really, how do we get that urgency? We hear the trillions of dollars that are now sitting in ESG funds all around the world. Everyone's saying there's capital, flood of capital. But as Elizabeth's saying, we can't get it to the right people. Is it that we've got lousy business plans, lousy entrepreneurs, or where is the obstacle? That was really my next set of questions. We know what the opportunities are. How do we get the money to the right people?
And Adam, just to clarify, are you talking about the opportunity in the broader SDG sense? Because obviously,
Yeah.
As Steve talked about, on the climate side, there is a lot of focus out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the SDGs more generally, but also the climate tech, as Steve was saying, the numbers still in Southeast Asia are still relatively low comparatively.
Right. I mean, look, I'll offer my explanation.
I'm not putting it on Temasik's shoulder.
Yeah,
put all the money out. But.
Yeah, Temasek has a lot of capital, but not enough to solve all of Asia's problems, for sure. I think it's a part of the process, and we are in the early days of that process. Asian countries, India and China were the big countries, took their climate goals recently, as we saw. That happened in November, China a little bit earlier. Indonesia was actually surprisingly ahead of the game. I think Singapore obviously has also made certain commitments around that. So I think we're part of that journey where the climate goals are relatively now getting to shape as well. I think there is Asian enterprises are realizing that it's not just for the Western enterprises to do it. I think they have to take their own goals. I think they are behind that. Large Asian companies have not taken to that proportion goals around that. And I think the third part of it, besides the regulation, the large companies are, the ecosystems are still in the early days of developing. So I'm very optimistic around the climate side of things. I think when it comes to the broader impact and the social impact side, I think there is, again, I think Asia has a little bit of catching up to do. I think I go back to the lack of capital that's going into impact, which kind of impact funds are the right sort of means to solve the capital gap that we have. Of course, a lot's coming from the government, from philanthropic organizations, but I think impact is the growing part of that. But there has to be more measurement of impact when it comes to social goals, poverty, equality, gender diversity, and all of that. And I think one of the things that Temasek Trust is doing is we have partnered with UN SDP Impact to actually start having a framework for measuring impact, which is customized to the Asian context. And that's something that we are hoping can actually evangelize more investment to get into that. So those are ways to make the enabling infrastructure happen.
Someone busting to say something there?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo some of the things that Anusha said. I think, from my perspective, we're really, really early in the game here. And in many respects, it kind of reminds me a little bit of what we saw 20 years ago when, the whole digitization wave started, and companies hired their chief digital officer, and that person sat in the corner of the office, and everyone was paying lip service to that person. We just tick, now we're digitized. And then 20 years later, it becomes embedded in organizations. And I think we've seen the same now, at least in Asia, with chief sustainability officers starting to be hired, sustainability plans starting to be developed, and a small number of companies developing, science-based targets and starting to report, ESG disclosures. And so it feels like we're really, really early on in this process. And I think, governments need to stand up more. I think, enterprise needs to stand up more, because even though some of them are going through this process at a very senior level, it hasn't trickled down yet. And so the talk hasn't turned into the walk and the action yet. And I think, I'd reflect a little bit on a conversation I had like a month ago with a CIO of a large real estate developer. And, I was talking about, climate change, how they're thinking about climate change and climate mitigation. And he said to me, well, look, we've won all these ESG awards. And I said, that's great. But how are you thinking about climate change in relation to your business? He said, oh, we've won all these awards. I said, well, what about climate risk to the buildings you have, which are going to be he said, oh, we can't do anything about that. Which is alarming, in the fact that, we have someone at that level of tens of billions of dollar listed entity,
Yeah.
still really early on in this thinking around just the risk to the assets, the billions of dollars of assets that they're managing, which could be underwater or impacted by extreme weather conditions.
Yeah.
But just one other point, I think, on issues that I'd like to mention as well, which is one of the things that I see, particularly with startups, is many of the climate and social impact startups I work with, the founders are super passionate. Of course they are, and they're idealists. Of course, to bash through the walls, you need to be an eternal optimist. But the challenge is, customers don't buy sustainability. And it doesn't matter how much you shout at them, they should be addressing sustainability. They should be buying the product or the service. They won't do it unless it's translated into business benefits. So one of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about is, how do you, translate your service into, look, we're going to reduce your cost. We're going to help you deliver your project, 20% faster. We're going to help you deliver, 20% better yield, which translates into more revenue or lower cost, which the outcome is less carbon emissions.
That's right.
And so, but you're just turning the conversation around. And so the business opportunity is to do that.
The value proposition. Yeah. Elizabeth, and perhaps switching a bit to Singapore while as we're in sort of closing time, and one of the questions about communication, in terms of, what does sort of Corteva do to try to make conversations about SDG sort of more commonplace in terms of kind of educating community or getting people on board? I know that Corteva has done a number of things in that area.
Yeah, I'll say my experience when I joined the industry 4 years ago, and I remember talking about the SDGs and zero hunger, and I had people telling me, "Oh, that's what governments and the Gates Foundations do. That's not what we do." And I had to spend a good year or so socializing that, even within the industry, within the company. So today, one of the things, so now it is something that's part of our goals as a new company. But what we do is, how do the general public, I think is your question, get to understand this? And where we focus on, it's the same way we want agriculture actually to be better known, right? We know that we have aging farmers in Asia, and their kids don't want to go into farming. So we focus on how do you make agriculture, actually a choice career for young people. And so we focus on people who are now very interested in sustainability, and show them that agriculture has a unique role, because yes, we're part of the problem. We're an emitter of methane and other greenhouse emissions, but we're also a key part of the solution, because which industry, you talked about trees earlier, which industry can actually take that carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it back into the soil? And a lot of kids don't know that, right? A lot of adults don't know the value of soil health. And so there's actually resurgence in that. And so part of that is re-educating people, getting us closer to our food production. And that's where there's so many moves on local. But we focus on developing, actually, we partner with an NGO called Action in Agriculture in Australia to develop resource materials, incorporating all the SDGs into their curriculum in primary school as well as in high school. And it partnered with, we're going to reach 30,000 kids and about 800 schools through 8,500 schools through the Sustainable Schools of Australia network. And then we'll take that curriculum and bring that through junior achievement to all of our science programs in partnership with other schools in Asia. But what it does, it puts it into action, right? It's an experiential type of module. So it's not just about, learning and reading, what about this, but they actually have to put it in art. They have to put it, apply it in school and do science experiments. And I think if you start doing that and making it part of them, and also taking the kids out of the classroom into the dirt, into the soil, having the gardening that we sponsor at schools, those are the types of activities that bring, we've been very successful in agriculture. So we actually have fewer and fewer people involved in food production today. What we need to do is get everyone back into producing part of their food and seeing the benefits as well.
And as you point out, nature-based solutions are such an important part of the overall solution. And again, continuing on the Singapore theme, Anuj, with obviously, Singapore, we've got the 30 by 30, but we're never going to be a major agricultural producer here. And everyone understands that. We're getting better at it, and we're approved alternative proteins, cultivated meat. But what about the sort of kind of financing role that Singapore can play? Because we were talking about access to finance. Green finance, do you see this as a very big part that Singapore can play as we become the green finance hub?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, Adam. And I think Elizabeth referred to the challenge with financing. So I think for modern technologies to proliferate, we need financing, and that requirement is acute in food and agriculture just by virtue of how that chain is structured with smallholder farmers, with a lot of middlemen, food traveling from one country to another. Unfortunately, agricultural financing, food financing is not a very well developed area, especially in emerging market countries, and remains a big area of gap. I think as Singapore develops some of these capabilities, we believe it is a big white space which Singapore can play a role in, and frankly, Temasek, we are very excited about doing something about it. The way I look at it is that being able to finance smallholders or the agriculture and food value chain to do the right thing should be more possible than it was 10, 15 years ago, because this is not a new problem.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been talking about it for the longest period of time. It just hasn't happened. Banks don't want to do it because they would much rather, finance someone's house because it's an asset, versus why do you want to take agricultural risks? And now with climate change, why would you want to do that even more? But I think there are three things that have happened. One is digital. So with digital, platforms, the gap, the information gap, and the process gap between the various players in the chain has actually shrunk. And e-fisheries is a good example with that, and there's so many other examples. So digitalization is beginning to proliferate in this value chain. The second thing is sustainability, and I think, Steve, you talked about sustainability and how your business model has to pay for sustainability. And there is now a value to sustainability with carbon credits. That market is not very well developed, but it is beginning to develop. Carbon pricing is getting there. We announced here in Singapore the Climate X exchange along with DBS and several other institutions, where we want to actually take the carbon market, bring it closer to home over here in Asia, and create credits which are actually credible and can be bought and sold. And Temasek is doing its bit. There are hundreds of others, people who are doing it. So the confluence of digital, the confluence of sustainability and putting value to sustainability, and more capital being available for impact are three pillars on which you should be able to come up with new solutions which solve these issues. I mean, I would encourage Steve to think about, and in his venture studio, that how do you create fintech solutions for farmers? I mean, there's fintech solutions for everything, but how do you get it for the small farmers, for the big farmers, for the middlemen, and with fintech it should be possible, with blockchain it should be possible. We think that's going to be a very exciting area, because all these technologies on gene editing or others, and I think, Elizabeth, we talked about it, are only going to develop if there is financing solutions available and last mile financing solutions as well.
But as you say, we've been on panels before and we've talked about this problem, and it just keeps on keeping on. I mean, and I'm sort of hearing from all of you that we're kind of on the cusp. We've got new entrepreneurs coming in the field who are retiring from businesses. They want impact. The opportunity is there. Targets are getting clearer. There is money around, but what's missing? Why are we not seeing more momentum, more traction? I mean, is it... what's the one thing, as we sort of move to close, that perhaps we're missing out on, or one or two things you think we're missing out on? Why are we still on the cusp? Steve? I mean, it's the silver bullet answer I'm looking for. Is it just time? Is it clarity?
I think it is time. I think it's also just, up until maybe, 2 years ago, there wasn't even, or maybe 3 years ago, it wasn't even consensus around climate change, let alone anything else amongst the climate scientists. And so I think we're still in the early stages of that. I think there are still some blocks. I think, if I think about sort of Southeast Asia, out of all the ASEAN countries, 2 have signed up to net zero commitments.
Right.
And that makes a big signal. If the government is really serious about it, makes a real commitment about it, then that's going to drive some change and some policies throughout the rest of the country.
Yeah.
I think there are some financing issues. So whilst there's a really, really active equity tech investment community, and also for climate tech as well, believe it or not, a lot of the companies that I work with struggle with debt financing, for example. If you want $100 million project financing from a large BlackRock, etc., yeah, fine. If you want a little bit, $500,000 venture debt from somebody else, no problem at all. You want $5-10 million to take your business, it's growing at 2 or 3x, but you have some working capital constraints that I haven't seen that yet. So there are some financing gaps still. I think Anushka's pointed to some of the things around smallholder farms, which of course highly fragmented. But I think nowadays we can address that a little bit better. So I think that there are some of those blocks that still exist.
Yeah. So it's time. I mean, one of the questions actually for you, Steve, is your carbon maps. Have they been verified? By
yeah, we've verified them ourselves. So.
I thought that might be the answer.
To be honest, I mean, it might sound a little bit flippant, but we're not trying to get it verified, right? So what we're trying to do is get beyond reasonable certainty that directionally where are the areas that we should be focusing on. And yes, you can see how much carbon emissions come from 2-wheelers versus 3-wheelers in Bangkok. And we can see actually it's not that much compared to a third of global carbon sinks being rapidly depleted. Like 50% of forests are going to go in our geography in the next 20 years if we're not careful, and all the peatland will disappear. So we just directionally are we in the right? Is it 12% versus 18%? I don't really care, to be honest. But what it does show is that there are some really big opportunities to build 100 megaton by 100 million revenue, so unicorn businesses in Southeast Asia around those opportunity spaces.
Well, I think what you've all done is demonstrated that the opportunities are there. I mean, we've got your map. You've identified areas on the website, and I understand the map's coming out at some point, perhaps.
I mean, the map's out with the 5 core buckets, areas. But the 50 opportunities underneath that, I guess we're going to be drip feeding that as we go.
Right. So that's there. The opportunities there for startups. There's the opportunities in novel financing and really trying to crack this one, and whether it's going to be something that perhaps might come through from Web3 or whatever other iteration. How do we manage to come up with solutions to make it easy for these funds that are sitting there to get to some of these problems? Everyone just says, oh, but the money's there, but it's not getting there. Okay, we've got to come up with solutions, solving real problems to get there. Now, there's one, actually, it's kind of funny. What are your thoughts on the movie Don't Look Up? Do you think it is an accurate representation of what's going on? Have you all seen Don't Look Up?
I haven't.
Oh, you haven't? Okay.
Yes.
Well, treat yourself on Netflix and have a look. It'll give you a laugh. It's satire. But have either of you seen it?
Nope.
Nope.
Yeah, I've seen it, and I enjoyed it because I think it was a parody, and I found myself laughing, but also feeling a little bit sad at the same time during the film. But I mean, it was a parody on a number of measures. I think for those who haven't seen it, but I don't want to spoil anything. But it was a little bit, analogies obviously to climate change, analogies to the whole polarization around opinions from various things, particularly from political parties' perspectives, and the frivolity of social media and the role that plays in our society. And it was good. But I think for me it was obviously the urgency around climate change, obviously.
Yeah, and I think sort of in closing for all of us, I think communication continues to be the thing that keeps coming out. Communication and education. How do people realize, A, the nature of the problem? I first got into this business when I saw The Inconvenient Truth many years ago, back in 2006. I thought, holy hell, this is really going to happen. And that was scary. The trouble is we have to have that balance between scaring people and providing the opportunity to make a difference and impact. And I think all of us have to take that on board in some particular way. But as I said, I think there are so many things that have come up this afternoon, which what we will do is build these in to further conversations over the course of the year. Do either of you have any closing remarks you'd like to leave the room with in terms of how we can perhaps overcome one of these major obstacles, or what your wish list might be?
Maybe from a Singapore government, since we talk about Singapore, right? I'd like to think about, we don't have the backyard or the agricultural fields here in Singapore, but I think Singapore's role, as you talk about finance, but also as a sandbox for a lot of the innovation that the startup communities, particularly in the food and agri-tech sector, is very important as a key part of the solution to what we're looking at. But I think it goes hand in hand. On the one hand, you've got the innovation, but I mentioned earlier the regulations, right? That environment that makes it really like building a Silicon Valley for agri-food tech, which is essentially what Singapore's trying to do. They go hand in hand. And if that can be a model that can grow across the region, right, where we can use a sandbox, develop the technologies here, perhaps identify partnerships here in Singapore that we can then go pilot. And if you can finance some of those pilots in Indonesia or India, wherever, right? So think about gene editing. You mentioned that, Anuj. If Singapore is looking at the gene editing regulations right now, if they were to come up with that, that could be potentially a new area where new startups could look at use technology in gene editing to breed new crops that are climate resilient, and perhaps can increase the carbon that they can sequester into their root system. That's the kind of breeding that we could use now to help with our climate challenge. But that's the role I think that Singapore can play in the region, and so that's where keeps me optimistic about the future, and that we have to keep the pace of regulation at the same urgency, right, so that we can get those solutions that we need.
Well, because a lot of regulation will actually force companies to do things. So that's the classic stick.
The incentives.
But the other positive regulation, like we saw with the cultivated chicken over 12 months ago, that creates a new industry. So that's positive regulation. We're building new industries. Others, if you don't do this, and as we're seeing, SGX is stepping up here and making requirements of companies to do things. So I think we're seeing a lot of opportunities in that area as well. Anuj, any final remarks?
I would just say that, look, when it comes to climate tech and the broader sort of impact investing area with SDGs focus, I think there is so much that can be done in Asia. It's a gold mine of opportunities that we need more talented entrepreneurs to crack that and have that stubbornness to be able to crack that. I think as Temasek, we've committed $5 billion to our carbon platform. We are doing obviously a lot of investments in the agri-food sector. We just find great opportunities, and of course, the key, one of the roles that we see ourselves having is to be an enabler and to look at across the sort of with a system lens where we can do that. So always welcome for new ideas and what can be done, but for any entrepreneur out there, this is the time to jump right into this sector.
The opportunity is there. Final word, Steve, or you think you're done? It's okay. I'll let. I thought you were looking for one. We're on time anyway, a little bit over. So please join me, those folks in the room, and thanking our panelists, Anuj, Elizabeth, and Steve, for their insights. Thank you very much. And I'll get into trouble if I don't tell people there's a barcode on the screen, a QR code. Take a photo of that. That'll take you, don't laugh at me, Grace. That'll take you to a survey. But in the hour that we've been here now, how long do we have to 2030? 7 years, 342 days, 6 hours, 2 minutes, and 28 seconds. The clock is ticking. We all have to take this very seriously. Go to the website. You'll see what's happening. Keep that time in mind as we go forward. Look at the opportunities. There's no shortage. The finance is there. There are many people that can assist, but we have to be creative to solve these problems. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
What can we do, and what are all of you doing to see how we can stop some of those practices that are really causing the problem?
Okay. Anyone like to think about stopping?
Without really thinking too much about it, I guess it's off the top of my head. I used to think that consumers don't really play too much of a role. I used to think that I watched Inconvenient Truth as well, and I thought it scared the hell out of me. But I thought, what can I do about it? Actually, the governments have to play the role, and therefore, after being shit scared for about a year or so, I kind of moved on to other things. I guess I thought that maybe consumers don't really play a role because they're too small and can't play a role. But what the conclusion I've now come to is actually, we all need to play a role, but I think consumers, play a role in many ways. So one is obviously voting. Two is, choosing which companies they want to work for. And thankfully, you get more and more companies wanting to work for purposeful companies and choosing to do so, and even at a lower salary. And consumers, investing their money in more sustainable areas and advocating around it. So I think consumers play. So from a consumer point of view, what can I do? I can use every opportunity I get given, whoever it might be, just to talk about this and try to change behavior, change my own behavior, change my own family's behavior, speak out about fossil fuel, about the Singapore banks, which continue to fund the fossil fuel and coal-fired plants until 2039. I guess like to see Singapore step up more and talk about that. I think the fact we don't have a net zero commitment yet is a little bit embarrassing. We've been sitting here for the last 17 years, and so I think talking about it is important as well, because I think by engaging and raising awareness from people, I think that can help move the needle as well.
Okay, I won't let you ask each of them because I just want to spread it around. But I think it's a really good point, Ken. I think it's something we should think about what does make sense. Lawrence, you had a question? May not be on. Yes, yes.
Right. Glad to be here. Thank you, panelists, for the insights. Just have one question. Steve, I think your point earlier about how the investments, 70% of the investments are going to EVs really resonated with me, right? And it's also kind of in line with what Tariq Bansi has said, BlackRock's former ESG CIO, around how ESG investing sometimes is not effective, and a lot of it is around marketing. So I guess my question is, how do you or anybody direct the investments, the capital, and not just the investment in capital, but also the brightest minds towards solving really critical issues, right? What is the way? What can be done about this? Thank you.
So directing to what areas people should be going after?
Yeah, some of the critical problems that you need to solve, whether it's plastic or whatever, but may not yield the greatest returns, or it may not be as sexy.
I can take the first stab at that. I think, having gone through this whole process myself, from 2018 till now, and thinking, look, I've been building businesses from a technology point of view for most of my career. And I've got, what do I have? I have time and I have money and the expertise of perhaps building companies. Now let's I want to be able to look my kids in the eye and say, look, I had the time and the money, and I tried to address things, because to be frank, it's the last generation that will have any significant impact to really shift the needle on, unless we're going to end up with a disaster. And so I went on this journey, and I became completely and utterly overwhelmed, because at the top end, you look at climate change, you look at what areas can you look at in climate change. Well, maybe one is around renewable energy, and then renewable energy, maybe you got long duration storage, and then you got like about 20 different battery systems in there, and you got like component, and so it becomes a little bit overwhelming. So then the conclusion I came to was, how do you focus then on technologies and adapting technologies, using business model adaptation, using finance to then accelerate the growth. And you build then venture grade, you can build venture grade companies. But where do you point your attention? And that was the reason why we did this carbon map. And that's where we highlighted the fact that EVs is not the area to focus. And so thankfully there are a growing number of entrepreneurs who really want to make a big impact. Entrepreneurs solve big problems. What could be a bigger problem than climate change? And what we try to do with Waymaker Impact is to say, look, we've done a lot of work on this already. We've identified where the big emissions are. These are the 50 opportunities, and let's go on a journey. Let's explore those opportunities and see what resonates. Because there's no point saying, okay, well, let's work on reducing methane on rice production if you're really interested in around industrial processes, reducing steam use or energy use from industrial processes or around building construction. So it's kind of an iterative process. But through that process, we will identify not only the entrepreneur but also the opportunity that they want to work on, and then together build a business.
Anyone else want to respond about directing?
Look, my sense is, in a capitalist and entrepreneurial world, you got to get information out there, and you got to have success, and that just automatically breeds people to go and do things. I think when it comes to climate tech and heads-on dealing with the issues of a net zero world, which we kind of get to, we just need to have more role models, more success stories. Go back. Tesla is one of the most valuable companies in the world, and Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. And that's the best thing that can happen to us, because the more people should realize that actually in the probably have more creativity than just doing the next EV company in Southeast Asia, but look at other areas. I think, like Steve said, there's a lot of information out there what the various areas are. We published a couple of reports on nature-based solutions, the opportunity, the investment gap, the opportunity out there, but it needs finally human capital, people, very talented people who let go of their steady incomes and jump into this because they want to change the world. And I'm optimistic it will happen. But one of the things as leaders we can do in different roles is to create ecosystems, facilitate capital, make sure that the governments actually take goals and create enabling infrastructures. And it's a matter of time. I see that. So more of what we have been doing in the last couple of years needs to be done with even greater resources.
Yeah, I think waiting for that first green unicorn is mixing metaphors perhaps, but is what we need, because that will be the role model. And I'm thinking we're going to see some interesting things, whether it's coming out of Singapore or whether it's coming out of Indonesia or wherever it might be. People really tackling. I mean, seeing what e-fishery is doing, for instance. That is. I predict you're going to see a lot happening in aquaculture in Indonesia, because he's such a fantastic visionary CEO, young and energetic. There'll be more people joining up. And obviously it comes back to communication again. So could have a mic. Oh, sorry. That's Will, I think, is it? Yep.
Thanks for the discussion. Really insightful. I'm interested in the panel's view about this, I suppose, increased focus on net zero action, and if I may use oversimplification of the focus on net zero, and whether it could create perverse outcomes, because I think the broader challenge around the role around climate and all the other SDGs, not just around net zero, it's around biodiversity collapse, and thinking of it as a very systems approach with that, which I think was a lot of the discussion here. How do we make sure that this 7-year pursuit towards net zero doesn't actually create an increased focus on shiny tech and thinking technology is going to solve all of our challenges? Because we must recognize that there's a lot of practice change and land use managers and natural resource managers that are on the ground, are working with communities and doing incredibly great things, and have the opportunity to leverage technology. So what are the risks associated with kind of tech's going to solve the solution versus bringing a lot of the practitioners that have been on the ground driving this change already for perhaps the last 50 years or more? Interested in your views.
So is that aimed at sort of, kind of regen agriculture or nature-based solutions, or where are you going with that?
Yeah, I think it encompasses regen agriculture, but also a lot of the regionally based groups like land use planning groups, right, and those that work in conservation that are already thinking about the role that, not just planting trees, but also the role that biodiverse species and, right, extinction and what implications that has towards equilibrium and balance in our ecosystem, and the role that that plays to actually drawing down carbon. And I think we talked about soil health and other things, but yeah, interesting.
Has that got your name on it, Elizabeth?
I don't have I don't know if I have an answer, but I think the way that I would view it is the partnerships really is the one that it's kind of the glue that brings a lot of these goals together. As I said earlier, they're interrelated. So as I think of what you said, and probably in response to the gentleman's question earlier about what to stop to, I'll say that one of the things that we've done is, as a new company, because Corteva was launched in June 2019, we came from Dow and DuPont when they merged in 2017, but we spun off as a separate company in 2019. And the nice thing with being a new company, a startup, so to speak, was we were able to choose our purpose and really putting sustainability at the heart of the company. Even the name Corteva actually means heart of nature. And so among the things that we did, if that's the purpose of enriching the lives of the producers and consumers, how do we do that through our own innovation? And how do we partner with all of the different players in the ecosystem to achieve that? So that's kind of the approach that we're doing. It's a work in progress, definitely, since we're only a couple years old. But with regenerative ag, and maybe this supports what you're saying, we do recognize, and that's my comment about technology, that there are so many existing technologies today that can already help us get there that are not yet accessible to the 450 million smallholder farmers in Asia, right? That account for half of the world's poor, half of the undernourished. So for me, because I'm in agriculture, that would be my first focus is with the existing technologies, how do you solve the access problem and get it into their hands? And how do we solve with the different parts of the value chain to reduce some of that fragmentation, right? So we can focus on that. But at the same time, I think it is important that there are other people that are thinking about the new technologies that might be able to accelerate us, because there's no way that we're going to be able to get there without new technologies coming online. So that has to be a dual track, right? We're meeting the needs of the farmers today, but we're also developing new solutions. And so that's how we view it. At the same time, what we would stop, even in our own portfolio, there are newer technologies, more sustainable crop protection solutions that are much more environmentally friendly. And so you stop producing the ones that are 30 or 40 years old from your portfolio. So you make sure the green chemistries or reduced risk chemistries that you have today that show to have a much better environmental footprint are the ones that you're making available to those farmers. So it's a combination of all those that you have to have in your toolkit, I think. I don't think, and to your question earlier, Adam, there is no silver bullet. That's why this is so hard, right? But I really believe that that's why the partnership is so important. And like I said, it takes probably 10 times longer to put these partnerships together, but then you probably also multiply your impact if you do so, rather than doing it alone. So what you stop doing is stop doing it alone. No company should be doing that, right? Because it doesn't make sense, especially in food and ag. It doesn't make sense. You should always be looking, even sometimes working with our competitors in some of these multi-stakeholder platforms, because that's what it's going to take to get us to where we want to go. So I think that I would go back to the partnerships being so critical and the skills that comes with. By the way, I mean, I've been doing government affairs, external affairs for a long time, and so dealing with governments, and the skills of negotiating multi-stakeholder agreements or partnerships is very, very different. I remember when SMU introduced a master's in trisectoral collaboration because it was so difficult. And so they wanted to put a cohort that had a third of government, a third of NGOs, and a third of businesses to learn how to talk to each other. It's kind of funny, but it's true that we didn't talk to each other for many years, just getting it at the table in the room. Today, at least, we're all at the same table, at the same conference. So that's why I'm hopeful. Maybe that's over-optimistic of me, but I feel that if all the best and the brightest, like you said, attracting the best and brightest, to solve this problem is what keeps me hopeful.
Good. See the movie. You'll laugh, but you'll get the idea. A very quick question from this gentleman, and then I'll release our panelists who I've stolen some time
Thanks
from.
for the forum. I think it was wonderful. My name is Nilesh, and I'm co-founder and CEO of a local startup here focusing on sustainable buildings, and of course, as part of a green unicorn. But my question today is actually more towards Elizabeth. I was quite curious. I spent about a decade in energy research, and we always talk about digitalization, decarbonization, and also decentralization. So I'm wondering, in the food agri world, how does decentralization really help, or does it help at all? And what are the approaches towards decentralization?
Is it decentralization?
Decentralization.
Yeah.
But specifically, Nilesh, decentralization in what particular way?
So, for example, in the energy sector, we see a lot of decentralization around putting solar panels on rooftops and on putting batteries at homes. Is this something happening in the food and agri world, which actually would take us more towards meeting SDGs or net zero? Why is it important?
So not necessarily what Corteva is doing right now, so from if that's what you're seeing, but I have had good discussions with a lot of farmers in Australia, for example, where the whole carbon trading is coming, and even the renewable energy, the solar panels on the farm, especially if you look at some of the farms in southwestern Australia that have really been affected by the drought, right? The 10-year drought. So it's like your sheep station is no longer a sheep farm because you don't have any, you started with 2,000 sheep and now you might have a dozen or so. So you have to have new source of revenue. So when we were discussing that, we thought of the farm of the future may not necessarily have that single source of income that we imagine it today, right? Where right now you have a rice field, and so everything's dependent on that rice crop and harvest. And if something happens, whether it's drought or flooding, then that whole income for that family is gone. And so we were talking about layers of income streams. So you might have solar panels that are earning you revenue, but then you have sheep grazing underneath them and provide. And there are perhaps some crops that can grow underneath the solar panels, right? You might have these types, and now with the gig economy, what this big work from home experiment has done is that you have people with expertise that are actually running their sheep station. And I know farmers like that who are also an agroecologists, right? Yeah. Working out of their very remote sheep station in Australia. So I think the future farm, we have to get creative about what those sources of revenue. And that's why I'm interested also in the carbon business or what's happening is because, and that's what I was asking you earlier, was how much of that carbon value will be captured by the farmer? That's what I'm curious about. So I tell you, with all of these movements around the carbon business, there has to be part of that carbon or sustainability dividend that goes to the smallholder farmer, because if it doesn't, we're not going to solve that equation.
Well, that's a great place to stop, because that will be one of the forthcoming future conversations is the role of carbon and what do the carbon markets mean, and exactly how do we use them not to just take more away from the farmers, but to give them something back so their fair share of that. And speaking of fair share, thank you again to the panelists for going into overtime, and thank you all for attending. You'll obviously get links and information. We look forward to welcoming you back and perhaps bigger events than this, but thank you all very much for coming out this afternoon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.